Greetings, Fire Chargers, Darkblade here, and in this video I will be inaugurating my reaction week with a reaction to the What is the Table of Nations page on the gotquestions.org website run by Got Questions Ministries. So let's get right into this. Genesis chapter 10, commonly known as the Table of Nations, is a list of the patriarchal founders of 70 nations which descend from Ham through his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So already we're starting to see a bias towards more fundamentalist or young earth creationist interpretations. It says a list of patriarchal founders instead of just a list of nations. 26 of the 70 descend from Shem, 30 from Ham, and 14 from Japheth. Genesis 10:32 sums up the chapter succinctly. These are the families of the sons of Noah according to their genealogies by their nations. Out of these nations were separated on the earth after the flood. Chapter 11 recounts a division at Babel. The text seems to imply, although it never explicitly states, that the list was intended to be an exhaustive account. It has traditionally been interpreted as such. No citations are provided for that statement. Nevertheless, this interpretation is speculative. All of the biblical genealogies are abridged. Key historical figures are included while lesser or less culturally relevant siblings are left out. It is possible that such is the case for the Table of Nations. The compiler of the Table of Nations may have focused his study on nations most significant to his own nation at the time of the table's compilation, while neglecting the founders of far-flung, perhaps even long-forgotten nations. While every nation is ultimately related to every other nation through Noah, his ancestral tie does not indefinitely perpetuate mutual cultural significance among his descendants. What does that last sentence even mean? While some of the nations listed are easily identifiable, some remain obscure. Numerous scholars have attempted to identify these unknown nations with varying degrees of success. Due to the archaic nature of the source material, there remains considerable ambiguity. The next paragraph. The accuracy of the Table of Nations has been called into question by the fact that some of the relationships described do not match up with modern comparative linguistics. For example, the Elamites are said to have descended from Shem, yet their language was not Semitic. The current linguistic thinking is that the Elamite language is an isolate with no known genetic relatives. The Canaanites are said to have descended from Ham, yet their language was Semitic. This objection assumes that their languages have never experienced any dramatic change. The region's history seems to suggest that this is a dubious assumption. Okay, this phrase, these sentences, presence, is a bit of a red flag, indicating that the author of this article does not know how linguistic evolution works. Linguistic evolution is when one language undergoes changes that result in something slightly different. Sometimes these changes are very big and result in a completely different language. Sometimes they're kind of small. But one thing that linguistic evolution does not do is that it does not change what other languages the language is or is not related to genetically. It doesn't change the language family. It does not change the genetic relationships. If language A is not genetically related to language B, then no amount of linguistic evolution to either language will affect their status as genetically unrelated languages. Regardless of how much change happens and what those specific changes are, languages A and B will still be genetically unrelated. The cultures of the region were constantly subject to migrations and invasions by foreign powers. The conquering empires often imposed their language and culture upon the vanquished. So it seems now that they're talking about language replacement, which is not the same thing as language change. Language change is when the language evolves. Language replacement is when a new language takes over. The Hellenizing of the Persian Empire following Alexander the Great's conquest is a classic example. Or consider the Israelites, who primarily spoke ancient Hebrew up until the Babylonian captivity and the Persian conquest. Then they adopted Aramaic, the official language of the Persian Empire. Well, there was also Aramaic used in the Neo-Babylonian and Neo-Assyrian empires ever since the Assyrian conquest of Aram about 740 BC. The Jewish Talmud was written in Aramaic, as were large portions of the books of Daniel and Ezra. Aramaic is thought to have been Jesus' native language. Following Alexander's conquest of Persia, the Jews adopted Greek as a second language. As a result, all of the New Testament was written in Greek. The languages of the region were not static. But this doesn't affect the genetic relationships. Geopolitical changes resulting in language evolution or replacement does not affect which languages are and aren't related to which other languages. The Hebrews invaded and conquered Canaan long before the Greeks, Persians, and Babylonians. Is it surprising that the Canaanites of the region adopted a Semitic language almost identical to Hebrew? That's not the point. The point is that the native Canaanite language is Semitic. As for the Elamites, if we want to make a case from Elamite, we have to start with Proto-Elamite. Proto-Elamite remains deciphered, so it cannot form the basis for a polemic against the Table of Nations. There is no evidence that the later non-Semitic Elamite underlines Proto-Elamite, and we do not know what influences may have altered the language at that time. See, again, we see examples of words and sentences indicating that the writer of this article does not know how linguistic evolution works. Proto-Elamite would be the genetic ancestor of Elamite. So if Elamite is not Semitic, it is not genetically related to its Semitic languages, then that would also apply to its ancestors and descendants. If Elamite isn't Semitic, then Proto-Elamite is not Semitic, because linguistic evolution does not change the genetic relationships between languages. It does not affect which other languages that your language is or is not genetically related to. Another objection to the Table of Nations is that several of the nations listed do not appear in the historical record as we have it today until as late as the first millennium BC. This has led to some critical scholars to date the table no earlier than the 7th century BC. This is a recurring criticism of the Bible. Rather than give the Bible the benefit of the doubt whenever it mentions a city or culture that doesn't appear anywhere else in the historical record, or whenever it places a culture in an era that antedates any other record we have from our limited sources, critics generally assume that the biblical authors were either disingenuous or ignorant. Such was the case for the ancient metropolis of Nineveh and the ancient Hittite civilization of the Levant, both of which were rediscovered in modern times in the 19th and 20th centuries, respectively, in a remarkable vindication of the Bible's historical witness. The fact of the matter is, our knowledge of ancient cultures is extremely fragmented and often dependent upon key assumptions. It is therefore speculative to argue that the Table of Nations was written solely based on the fact that some of the nations mentioned appear nowhere else than in later historical records. Yeah, I think to make that would be like an argument from ignorance, an appeal to ignorance, which is basically I don't have any evidence that X is true, therefore X is false. And for example, I don't have any evidence that, let's say, Tiras from Genesis 10:2 existed in the 13th century in or before the 13th century BC, therefore it didn't. That would be an argument, an appeal to ignorance, which is a logical fallacy. One of the final concerns is the fact that Nimrod is said to have been a son of Cush, who is believed to have founded Nubia just south of Egypt. Yet Nimrod is established several Mesopotamian cities that show no sign of Nubian origin. Does that mean, as some critics claim, that the table is therefore manifestly wrong either about Nimrod's lineage or his role in establishing the Mesopotamian cities? Skeptics who make this argument overlook the fact that Cush also fathered the founders of at least six Arabian nations, none of which show signs of Nubian origin. So again, it seems to be biased. The presentation seems to show a bias towards a fundamentalist or young earth creationist interpretation of the Bible, because it seems to favor an interpretation that has the names mentioned in the Table of Nations be specific individual persons. This is because Nubia developed along its own cultural path over many generations. Nimrod was an immediate son of Cush. We have no reason to expect him or the cities he helped establish to show any signs of Nubian origin. Keep in mind that the Nubian civilization is very old. I don't know how old exactly, but one thing I do know is it's at least as old as the second intermediate period of Egypt. So this is before the 18th dynasty New Kingdom. In summary, the Table of Nations presents the biblical ethnological view that all nations descend from Noah through three of his sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. It is not known whether the list of 70 was meant to be exhaustive, or if there were some nations left out intentionally or accidentally. The accuracy of what we do know about the table has been called into question with skeptics whose polemical objections tend to be defective and insubstantial. And I think that Answers in Genesis' response on one count was a bit defective and insubstantial. Due to the archaic nature of the source material, the veracity of the table ultimately remains undeterminable. In the end, those who accept it do so by faith, taking for granted as part of a larger justifiable perspective. Those who reject it ultimately essentially do so for the same reasons. So that was Got Questions Ministries page on the Table of Nations. The only thing that was like that I found problematic were its bias towards a fundamentalist / young earth creationist interpretation of the text, and some ones that indicate the article author does not know how linguistic evolution works. So that is all for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you tomorrow in my next episode of Reaction Week. Dark Blade out.